It begins with the reflection that the failed policy decisions of the past, rushing to war, regime change in Iraq, or toppling Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. Mossadegh was the president. CIA and others got rid of him to protect British petroleum interests. The Shah of Iran came in, a brutal dictator, and he was thrown out by the Islamic Revolution, and that is where we are in Iran today. Decisions have consequences, often unintended consequences. So whether it was Saddam Hussein or Mossadegh or Guatemalan President Arbenz in 1954 in Guatemala, Brazilian President Goulart in 1964, Chilean President Allende in 1973. This type of regime change, this type of overthrowing governments we may not like, often does not work, often makes a bad and difficult decision even worse. These are lessons we must learn.
And here's the phrase that he used to describe what he was afraid that the CIA might become. He said, American Gestapo. So Truman was very unwilling to use the CIA this way. Now the British were really in trouble. They had nothing. But then, at the end of 1952, the British Foreign Office and the Secret Service were electrified with the news that there had been an election in the United States, and a new group was coming into power. New president would be Dwight Eisenhower, and new Secretary of State would be John Foster Dulles, who had spent his entire life as the #1 international corporate lawyer for big American companies. The roster of the clients that John Foster Dulles served is essentially just a list of all the giant multinational corporations of that era. So the idea that a country somewhere out there in the world was bothering a big, giant multinational corporation or a big British or American corporation was something that Dulles took very seriously. He didn't want that example to spread. So finally, the Americans decided, we will do this. President Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles reversed the Truman policy. And they told the British, okay, we're going to do it for you. We're going to go over to Iran, and we're going to overthrow Prime Minister Mossadegh. And in the beginning of August 1953, a very intrepid CIA agent crossed over into Iran with the assignment, organize the overthrow of the government. And it's one of those wonderful quirks of history that the agent that was sent to Iran was Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, who had brought America into the regime change era back in the time of the Spanish-American War. Well, it only took Kermit Roosevelt 3 weeks to organize the overthrow of the democratic government of Iran. It didn't just mean the end of Prime Minister Mossadegh's rule. It meant the end of democracy in Iran. Now, I think many people today don't even understand that Iran ever was a democracy. But in fact, this is a country that's had a constitution for more than 100 years. And in the early 50s, it really was consolidating its democracy. If we had managed to keep our hands off Iran, we might have had a thriving democracy in the heart of the Muslim Middle East all these 50 years. And I can hardly wrap my mind around how different the world would look if we had only managed to keep our hands off. Now, I talked about unintended consequences. In the period immediately following the overthrow of Mossadegh, Americans were very happy. Kermit Roosevelt was welcomed into the Oval Office of the White House and given a secret medal in a private ceremony. And he briefed President Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles on how it had been done. Oh, it was so successful. Dulles immediately went out and started doing this again. Within a year, less than a year, we went off and overthrew another government down in Guatemala. So the Iran operation seemed like a great success. We got rid of a guy we didn't like, Mossadegh. And we replaced him with a guy, the Shah, who would do everything we wanted. So it was a perfect outcome. Doesn't look quite so perfect now. Let's try to trace, very briefly, what happened. So the Shah ruled with increasing repression for 25 years. His repression produced the explosion of the late 1970s, what we call the Islamic Revolution. That revolution brought to power a clique of fanatically anti-American mullahs who have spent the last 25 years bitterly and sometimes very violently working to undermine American influence all over the world. That revolution in Iran also weakened Iran enough so that Iran's biggest enemy, next door Saddam Hussein, decided to invade Iran. We were so angry at Iran that we became military allies of Saddam Hussein. President Reagan sent a high-level special envoy to meet twice with Saddam Hussein. And of course, that envoy was none other than Donald Rumsfeld. I love that photo of Rumsfeld shaking Saddam's hands. It says it all. We provided helicopters to Iraq to drop poison gas inside Iran. We provided Iraq with bombing coordinates so they could strike at targets inside Iran. So that not only shook that region, but it also brought the United States into its death embrace with Saddam. That was the beginning of the spiral down in Iraq that led us to this present debacle. The turmoil of the Islamic Revolution also led the Soviets to be terrified that there would be copycat revolutions all along their southern front. That's what led them to invade Afghanistan. And their invasion of Afghanistan is what led us to go over to Pakistan and spend hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars to train huge armies of jihadis to go off and kill the infidel. We didn't realize that those jihadis we trained were going to become the Taliban, and the infidels that they wanted to kill would be us. All of that stemmed from 3 weeks of history in 1953 in Iran.